Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. In today's episode, we're going to get a little bit theoretical, if you will, because something's been happening that has really piqued my interest, and I feel like we should discuss it as a group today, and maybe you guys can help me come up with some answers to some questions that I have. You've probably seen in the news that China has been going about the world brokering peace deals between nations. We saw it for a while with Ukraine and Russia, and I wrote a little bit about that as well in the newsletter. And we recently just saw China successfully broker a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia that has seen them opening up their embassies to one another for the first time in 7 years. I guess I have some questions about this. First of all, what is going on? This seems to have really come out of left field. A lot of China watchers and also Middle East watchers have even commented about how this is, very unusual and no one really saw this coming. I want to get to the bottom of what are the origins, I guess, or what's the goal, where did this come from and where is it going? I also have questions around China's qualifications, if you will. So obviously not literal qualifications, but sort of what rule book is China following? Is there a rule book that you can follow? Whose example can they take from? Are they just setting their own example and just, doing their own thing? I also have questions around the idea of interference or non-interference, right? So China has this policy that they often critique the US for doing, which is that they do not interfere in other people's internal affairs. But is what they're doing through their mediation not an example of them meddling in other people's internal affairs? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. This is something that we should explore, and this is something that we will talk about today. So I think a good place for us to start would probably be by answering the question of what exactly makes a good peace builder or mediator or negotiator. And does China fulfill these requirements not just generally, but also specifically in the two cases that we'll be talking about today? I did a lot of reading about this because I don't really know that much about the theory of international relations studies, if you will. I came across quite a reliable and handy source, which is the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Global Security Studies. So this is one of my main sources when it comes to definitions for this episode. I will link that and all the other sources that I read as well down below so you can explore them for yourself if you are interested in reading more about general global studies, global governance, security, things like that. So, according to this encyclopedia of global security studies, mediation can be summarized in a number of different ways, but essentially contains the following qualities. Mediation is a model of dispute resolution which lends itself particularly well to situations where the parties have become entrenched in their positions. A process in which an impartial third party who has no stake in the outcome and has no power to impose a decision guides disputants through a non-adversarial discussion process that has its goals at the settling of disputes. It's a voluntary process, a private process, an outcome-oriented process that focuses on trust building, developing open communication, neutrality of the third party, confidentiality, and generating sustainable win-win solutions. Mediation is dynamic, structured, interactive, non-adversarial. The third party should be neutral and trained, and the idea is to foster communications to resolve conflict. We already have a lot of things to go on right there, not only about what makes a good mediator, but also what the process should be and how it should be approached by all three parties involved. I think we can pick out the main qualities of the mediation process to be something where you have an impartial mediator, a process that's informal, that's outcome-oriented, that has the voluntary participation of all parties, that is confidential and private, and has this sort of overarching authority that can help guide the process to completion, but is not necessarily going to impose a decision. So they're just there to facilitate what's going on. Interestingly, a lot of the reading that I did said that mediation could probably be traced back to China around 3,000 years ago, during the sort of Confucian era. I would say my understanding of Confucianism, stories that you can read about Confucius himself, written by his disciples. I don't know if you could say that was the origin of mediation, but it's certainly a core principle of Confucianism. One of the things that he used to do was go around to different states because China was not unified at this time. So he used to go around to different states and talk to the princes and the governors of those states and try and get them to come to a more peaceful agreement with their neighbors so that China wasn't constantly at war. It was a very humanistic approach to peacekeeping, if you will. So I could say that potentially it is true that Confucius or Confucianism was sort of like a leader in the idea of mediation between states. Not to say that peacekeeping didn't exist before him. That principle is definitely held within Chinese Confucian thought. So perhaps this does lend some credence to China being a peacekeeper. I suppose it depends on the extent to which you think that China goes by Confucian principles these days. I'd say they don't outright reject them like they did in the socialist period. And it's much more common to sort of embrace Confucian theory in Chinese leadership these days. So who knows, perhaps that's where they're getting this impetus to become this global mediator from. I think something else to point out about mediation is that there are different types, again, according to this encyclopedia. I think that's something that we need to note because China has received a lot of criticism for the way that it's approached both its mediation process in Russia and Ukraine and in Saudi Arabia and Iran. I feel like the critique may lie in the fact that China has a different approach to, say, your typical Western superpower would have towards mediation. Some different types of mediation methods. You have facilitative mediation, in which the mediator does not give opinions, advice, and does not make recommendations. You've got evaluative mediation, where the mediator gives the parties an informed view or opinion and lets them know the strengths of their respective legal positions. You have a rights-based model of mediation, where the mediator personally helps parties to evaluate their respective strengths and weaknesses. And you have problem-solving mediation, where parties are encouraged to compromise in order to reach a settlement of the dispute. And the list goes on, but I feel like those are the main ones. So I feel like looking at these examples, China is definitely leaning towards the sort of facilitative method, just bringing people together and having a chat. Whereas other bodies that we will discuss would lean more towards actively imposing or even guiding the parties to a solution that is based on what they feel is right or wrong, whose rights should be upheld over somebody else's, who has a real claim, for example, a territorial claim or a leadership claim, things like this. I feel like that's where the criticism of China's methods of mediation come in. However, I don't think that those criticisms are necessarily valid, because as we see, there are different ways that you can mediate. If anyone's ever tried to mediate between, say, two children, or if you've tried to negotiate anything with your significant other, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. When it comes to different examples of mediation, everyone's probably familiar with bodies like the UN, the EU. You've got economic bodies, for example, the RCEP or RCEP, as I like to call them, in Asia. You've also got the ASEAN in Asia. Another body that's come to the fore a lot more recently is NATO, of course, which is a military body. So different types of entities can participate in the mediation process. However, after the end of the Cold War and also with the rise of globalism, we see the rise in these supranational bodies that take the lead in trying to solve global problems. So the reason for this is because obviously things like people, money, goods, services, diseases are now a lot more fluid than they were before globalization, and during the Cold War, where borders tended to be more closed. And so with the free movement of all of these things, it becomes necessary for governing bodies that are above, say, individual borders between two nations to be able to step in and oversee and even legislate about the movement of these things. So oftentimes, while these bodies are quite effective in overseeing and legislating and sort of regulating the movement of these things, that's not necessarily to say that they are also good at maintaining the stability of this movement, or say maintaining a long-standing peace between two neighbors who have a disagreement about the movement of these people, goods and services. I think a good recent example of this would be, say, Brexit, where the UK left the EU. This was because they felt that the EU, or the people who voted for Brexit, felt that the EU was over-legislating laws to the extent where the people of the UK no longer had a right to make their own decisions about who was coming in and out of the country, what goods and services they could acquire, and just how in general their own legislative system was being overridden by a central body that they felt was unelected. It is partially unelected, but we do also have members of European Parliament, but essentially they felt that European laws were becoming stronger than UK laws. In this case, the EU was not able to maintain a lasting harmonious relationship with one of its most important members who held very important positions within all of the EU commissions and councils. So it just goes to show that even important nations within important bodies can disagree even when they have some sway over, say, legislation within those bodies. You see this also with the UN. The former sort of chair of the UN, Kofi Annan, even commented on the often ineffectiveness and inefficiencies of the UN's ability to maintain stable peace throughout the world. So he said, no part of the UN peacekeeping system addressed the challenge of assisting countries with the transition from conflict to long-lasting peace. Reform was urgent and necessary because member states are deeply divided on various issues which paralyze collective action and cripple multilateral institutions. Here we have the very important point being made that within these supranational bodies, you have different governance systems, which is something that we'll come back to. But essentially here, I just want to point out that even, say, the 5 members of the UN Security Council, you've got 3 liberal democracies and 2 autocracies. There's no way that they're going to be able to come to an agreement at all times. And perhaps that conflict is necessary so that, again, they can mediate and come to a compromise. But when you're talking about pressing global issues, that's not necessarily the best way to approach these things. So these supranational bodies have their flaws. If a supranational body cannot be relied upon consistently to govern disputes or mediate disputes between, say, 2 nations or 2 peoples or 2 economies or 2 whomevers, is there then a role for individual nations to act instead, and for individual nations to act as a neutral body? If we go back to our Dictionary of Global Studies, it has this concept of global governance, right? So it defines global governance as follows: a reaction to several developments that emerged in the second half of the 20th century, including the end of the Cold War, economic liberalization, economic, cultural, and technical globalization, the movement of people, goods, and services, the rising agency of non-state actors, the interdependence between non-state actors and states, and the densification and juridification of international relations. So these are already things that we've just discussed. These developments contributed to the growing perception that there are problems and challenges that can no longer be dealt with states or existing international organizations only because they cross borders and levels, becoming transnational or global challenges. Besides the urge to globally respond to global challenges, the feeling of shared responsibility is a more recent development that is contributing to the demand for global governance. What I wanted to pick out here was this idea of shared responsibility, the idea that any situation going on in any country at any time in the world is somehow also the responsibility of states, parties, individuals that may not have even known where that place was on the map before they heard about the issue. You see this, in my lifetime, issues like the Iraq War, which is 20 years ago now, Syria, more recently, places like Venezuela, that you may not really know anything about the country, but you know all about the problems that it's going through, the suffering that the people are undergoing, and how that affects not only themselves, but also their neighbor and other countries in general. In an ideal global system, we would be able to deal with these issues as a team, if you will, again, as part of a body like the UN or the EU that can step in and deal with these issues as a group. However, as we've pointed out, the conflict between the states that make up these supranational institutions is a limiting factor. Another quote from our encyclopedia goes, "The ideal model that global governance strives to be based upon is heterarchic or polycentric governance between all actors, a horizontal self-coordination among equals with strong incentives to cooperate and comply with self-given and deliberatively constituted norms and rules." However, in reality, what we have is extremely heterogeneous systems, models of governance, systems of even democracy varies from one country to another. And oftentimes, these individual actors that make up these large organizations cannot even agree on what the end goal of a conflict should be. For example, something that China would consider to be a Western import-export that was not so important to bringing around world peace is democracy, for example. Given all that we've discussed above, some more questions. Can a state really be neutral when it tries to mediate? Can anybody be neutral when it's trying to conduct negotiations between two actors? Is China neutral? And if not, what exactly are they trying to export? How are they interfering? What are their goals when it comes to mediation if they are not neutral and if it is impossible to be neutral? I think the best way to answer these questions may be to take a look at the cases themselves now that we're like halfway through the podcast and actually talk about Saudi Arabia and Iran and Ukraine and Russia. So let's start with the Iran deal. Saudi Arabia and Iran cut off ties formally around 7 years ago. However, the issues that they've had predated the execution of the Shia cleric that set off protests. His name was Namir al-Namir. Ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Iran and Saudi Arabia have had issues for various reasons. The first and most glaring issue is, of course, the fact that Saudi Arabia is a Sunni majority country and Iran is a Shia majority country. I won't get into the differences, but trust me, they are fundamental. If you don't know about Islam, these are very deep-rooted things that cannot just be solved overnight. The second issue is that Saudi Arabia is obviously a monarchy. It's not a theocracy like Iran is. Iran is governed by a sort of Muslim clergy rank of people, whereas Saudi Arabia has a monarchy that adheres to Sharia law. They legislate and adjudicate and run the country. They're both oil exporters, and so there's competition there. They're both vying for dominance in the Middle East. A lot of people think that the Syrian civil war was a proxy war somehow between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I don't know a lot about it, so I can't make a judgment either way. And of course, Iran is currently under sanctions by the US, whereas Saudi Arabia is quite a close ally of the US. So you have all these tensions that are underlying in the first place, then you have complete breakdown around 7 years ago. And now somehow, miraculously, China has been able to get a complete turnaround in the situation. It's not exactly clear how they managed to do this. As we discussed at the beginning of the episode, one of the tenets of mediation is that it should be a private, sort of closed-door, intimate, informal experience that outside onlookers cannot pass judgment on, they can't peep in and sort of say you're doing it wrong or you're doing it right. So all we have is the results. And the result is that Iran and Saudi Arabia have restarted diplomatic relations, which it was not expected at all. So China started holding talks between the two countries in 2021. According to one article, the trilateral statement says that Saudi Arabia and Iran have resolved their differences through dialogue and diplomatic means to abide by the purposes and principles of the charters of the UN and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and follow international regulations and practices. According to one expert on the issue, I don't think anyone saw this coming, especially not through Beijing. All eyes have been on the Baghdad track and the discussions underway in Amman, Jordan, under the auspices of French diplomacy. The breakthrough also marks a further decline in US diplomatic power in the region and the assertion of strategic autonomy by China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So the author there has brought out a really important point again about the decline of what China would deem US global hegemony and the rise of China as this reliable mediating body that can be called in instead of and even over the top of supranational bodies. So even though the US has sanctions in Iran, China was like, we don't care about that. We're going to do what we want to do regardless of what the US is doing. This is obviously something that a lot of other nations couldn't just do. Say the UK wanted to start dealing with Iran, they would have to bypass the US. And that's not something that's very likely to happen. So you'd have to be in a very good situation competitively with the US to even consider going down that route. Again, going back to the idea of neutrality, is China a neutral party in this transaction? The obvious answer is no. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia are very important parts of the Belt and Road economic Silk Road, new Silk Road system in China. Also, as China is reliant on them for their inroads for the Silk Road, they are also very heavily reliant on China. So you've got this kind of mutual bond between them that's probably the main underpinning of this new peace. So how are the three countries all related to each other economically? Well, Iran has recently signed a 25-year cooperation agreement with China, which allows China to invest $400 billion over the next 25 years. The supreme leader of Iran has said that the Islamic Republic will never forget China's cooperation during the sanctions era. So again, we're going back to this idea of Iran relying on China not only economically, but also politically. In terms of Saudi Arabia, China plays a very important role in something called the Saudi Vision 2030, which goes as follows. It aims to wean the Saudi economy away from its dependence on oil derivatives, in addition to diversifying the economy and improving investment in the public services sector, such as developing infrastructure and tourism, improving means of recreation and entertainment, based on the kingdom's religious status, in addition to its strategic location linking 3 continents. The Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative achieve the kingdom's ambition to diversify its economy away from oil, according to the kingdom's Vision 2030, to become a major economic and investment force connecting continents. And then another report also states that China accounts for around 13% of Saudi Arabia's exports, making it the lead destination for Saudi Arabian goods at around $5.1 billion in May 2022. So it's clear to see that China is important to both of these countries, as well as both of these countries being important stops along the Silk Road trade route. What about the Russia-Ukraine situation? Again, this is something that I talked about in my newsletter. I spoke about how China was forming this plan for peace for Russia and Ukraine. I think at the time that I wrote it, we hadn't seen the plan, but we have seen it now, and you can go online and read it for yourself if you want. The plan has been heavily criticized by foreign observers for not really achieving anything substantial. And also you would have seen recently that Xi Jinping visited Moscow for 3 days and sort of hung out with Putin and, walked down really long corridors while national anthems played. And they sort of sat in chairs facing each other and said how amazing the other one was. Everything that came out of that was more to do with sort of economics or politically just, giving platitudes of friendship and support and things like that. And Ukraine, at least publicly, was not discussed. I'm sure behind doors, that's probably all they spoke about, right? But in front of the cameras and when it came to the things that were signed, at the end, we saw very little, in fact, nothing to do with Ukraine. So again, China's plan for peace has been criticized by the West because a typical Western approach, say a Western military superpower that had economic influence and supranational alliances in that region that were interested in the war having a specific outcome, would not have taken this approach. They would have, come in guns blazing, if you will, kicking down doors and demanding that Russia do this, that, or the other. Whereas, again, we have China taking this more facilitative approach towards mediation, whereby they don't tell you what to do, they kind of just encourage you to talk to each other. And that's what the plan says. The plan basically says, we think you should, everyone should calm down, put the guns down, have a sit down, have a chat, everyone else should butt out and just let Ukraine and Russia talk it out. Again, they don't mention the US by name. However, it's heavily implied that when they say things like other countries should stop interfering, that they are talking about NATO, which again, China believes is a US proxy. Is China neutral in the case of Russia and Ukraine? No, for the reasons that we've discussed a few podcasts ago called Will China Fight Ukraine with Russia? Russia is extremely dependent on China, especially now that certain countries have put Russia under sanctions. Russia can only rely on China realistically, and whomever China brings to the table that, to buy goods or energy or whatever it is from Russia. Russia's friends are China's friends at this point, and China's holding all the cards. However, it's not just Russia that China's interested in. They're also interested in bringing the talks to a close, again, because of the Belt and Road system, which also goes through Ukraine in their plans. And China has invested in Ukraine. And actually, point number 12 in their plan for peace even belies this fact. It says, the international community needs to take measures to support post-conflict reconstruction in conflict zones. China stands ready to provide assistance and play a constructive role in this endeavour. We have figured out that China is not a neutral party. And I don't think they ever pretended to be. I don't think they ever said that they were going to go into this, we have no stake in this game whatsoever. But if they have, they're lying. However, I think that something that we should discuss on top of all of this, another question for you guys, is does it actually matter whether a state is neutral or not, or whether the third party in the mediation process is actually neutral. It's very difficult to achieve neutrality, as we discussed when we gave the examples of the EU and the UN. Everyone has something that they want, whether they want you to be a democracy too, so that we can rope you into our liberal democratic capitalist system, or if we want you to join the EU as well, so you've got to change your government, Turkey, and get on board with this ship so that we can use your people and your goods and your resources and whatever. So if neutrality is difficult to achieve, and if China is able to bring peace seemingly without neutrality, why should neutrality even be a standard in the first place? Well, I have some thoughts on that. You guys can let me know whether you agree or disagree. I feel like one of the reasons is that if you have a stake in the negotiations coming out well, you are more likely to take the quickest and easiest road, which may end up just, slapping a superficial plaster over the issues so that you can just smooth things over quickly and get to where you need to go without really resolving the deep underlying issues. I think this may certainly be a case with, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia, where we may see, as I mentioned earlier, the conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias. It goes back to just after Muhammad died. So I don't think this is something that China would have been able to solve in 3 years. I could be completely wrong about that, but it doesn't seem like there has been some global Islamic reconciliation between these two parties. These rifts run very deep. Why does China feel that they are able to suddenly solve this issue that Muslims amongst themselves couldn't even solve? So it could be that they just didn't try and solve it at all, which isn't necessarily a problem, but then it begs the question, on what grounds is this peace based, right? If it's not based on a full, deep resolution of the underlying issues, what is this peace based on? I feel that one answer that we've discussed is obviously the economic support, which I feel is potentially a problem, because if two parties in a conflict are both relying on a third party to support them economically, and then the economy of that third party suddenly for some reason one day just collapses, where does the interest lie for you to maintain peace between each other? If you've been fighting over who's the dominant oil exporter in the region, and another party comes along and said, hey, I'll buy both of your oils for the same price and we'll keep prices stable, but then one day they are not able to fulfill that bargain, what's to stop you just reverting back to the same conflict and quarrels that you had before? So for me, the problem is we don't know what the peace is based on, and it is supposed to be an informal, private conversation that we don't know about, but it would probably be good to know in this instance, just so that we know, hey, China's economy is collapsing. We might want to revisit the Saudi Arabia, Iran problem before that kicks off, because they don't have anywhere to export their oil to anymore. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that point. Another issue, not only from a Western perspective, but also I kind of agree with this point too, is that China has this policy of non-interference with internal conflict. If you have a non-conflict ridden country, this wouldn't necessarily be an issue. Where you have, say, a smaller military power that is being dominated by a larger military power and whose people are being slaughtered, is it not in your best interest to influence the larger power that's trampling on the rights of the smaller power, even just a little bit, even if you do have to draw that territorial boundary that you're so hesitant to draw, even if it's just to save some lives and potentially even make yourself look better, right? There's no problem. You won't have to save face. Both parties are reliant on you economically and politically. You could very easily say, hey, we're drawing this line in the sand. No one's to cross it anymore. Settle your differences here and now. Apart from Russia and Ukraine, in Iran as well, the Iranian protests at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, China, I'm assuming, I haven't seen any comments from them. So China, I'm assuming, has just glossed over this issue and has not tried to export, say, any, not even new governance, but just any sort of, hey, as a government, maybe you should be more understanding and listen to your people. China basically wrote the book on mass protests and how to suppress them. So I don't think they're going to be lecturing Iran anytime soon, but that's not necessarily in the interest even of this peace deal, because if Iran's government is suddenly toppled by these protests, or is just in general never stable, then how can it maintain peaceful relations with its neighbor when they're constantly worried that protests from Iran will spill over into Saudi Arabia? That's a real concern, and that is definitely something that could destabilize this seemingly fragile peace that China's conjured up. So if we don't know upon what the peace is based, and it's not, government reform, and it's not a resolution of a 1,000-year-old theocratic conflict, and it's just economic, I think things definitely have more potential to just fall apart at any time. So now I just have one more question. Promise this is the last one, which is something that I've been dancing around for most of the episode, which is this question of democracy. Democracy is something that Western countries worry about a lot when it comes to China's increasing global interference. Since the Cold War and since the beginning of globalisation, it's liberal democratic economies that have been at the forefront of any sort of globalist scheme. But now you've got an autocratic country sort of taking the reign and not even imposing anything, just saying, hey, it's okay to be different. It's okay not to be a democracy. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of democracy and what its place in the global system is, as far as I can do that in like 5 minutes. So something that's probably important to know is that only around half of the global states are democracies, and the other half, roughly generally speaking, are autocracies like monarchies or one-party states, dictatorships, things like that. However, even though democracy only makes up a half of the world, not only are democratic states more likely to be peaceful in and of themselves and towards their neighbours, they're also more likely to never come into conflict with other democracies. So I think since World War II, no two democracies have gone to war with each other. So potentially, because they understand each other's rights-based systems, and because they respect the freedom of the individual, and because they're more likely to have friendly talks with each other, because that's their whole governance systems are based upon those principles, you are more likely to have a peaceful world system if more countries are democracies. Autocracies are more likely to fight amongst themselves. You can fact check me on that if you want, but from the reading that I read, this is the conclusion that I came to. That's not to say that there is no violence at all within democracies, especially within brand new democracies. So you see that a lot when the US exports a democracy to a country. Often it will break down into conflict. You saw this in Iraq 20 years ago as well. Something that China would argue is that not every country is suited to democracy. And shockingly, this is a point that I would actually agree with. It's quite controversial, I think. It might be a potentially non-PC thing to say, but taking somewhere like Japan, which is a completely like homogenous society culturally and ethnically, and saying, hey, this is a great example of how to do a democracy, isn't necessarily a great example, because a lot of countries that are the rest of the world, if you will, so not the West and not developed East Asian countries and not the nice South American countries, like African countries and, the Middle East, the problematic children of the world. The reason that there's so many problems within these countries is because they are extremely tribal. So I've mentioned before that my family is Nigerian. Nigeria is an excellent example of a country that has interpersonal conflict, both at a personal level and a cultural and societal level. It's a country divided basically between 3 large ethnic groups, but there are many, many, like hundreds of ethnic groups. And the government is known for being corrupt and nepotistic and based on kinship and tribalist ties. And even as recently as the 1960s, there was an ethnic civil war that led to the decimation of one of the tribes that was living in the area dominated by the northern Muslim tribe. In somewhere like Nigeria, you've got conflict based on ethnic grounds, you've got conflict based on linguistic grounds, you've got conflict based on local governance systems. Some areas believe in equality of women and some don't. Some are Catholic, some are Christian, some are Muslim, some are spiritualist. It's like a huge melting pot. And while that makes for a fun conversation, it doesn't necessarily lead to a good governance system. So I would actually agree that in some cases, democracy is not just like a copy and paste system that you can just slap onto any peoples and expect it to work. It requires people to be coming to the table willing to negotiate in the first place. And it doesn't necessarily bring you to the end goal that you want. If your goal is to bring peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, democracy is not necessarily the answer or even part of the equation in the first place. So I do understand China's perspective, where it's like, hey, it's much easier and you'll get to where you want to go faster if you're just really transactional about this. If you just say, hey, we can build a great little economic system here, we can be a good corridor between all the continents and everyone can prosper, and you don't have to be poor or struggling or under sanctions. You don't have to fight with your neighbor over oil exports or trying to curry favor with Western nations. We will help you regardless of your governance system. Yes, this could be a more fragile peace, but is a fragile peace better than no peace at all? Another question. Sorry, I said I would stop asking questions, but there's one more for you. So to start wrapping all of this conversation up, I think it's quite obvious what China's getting out of this. They're getting their ability to appear on the global stage as the major power, which is their main aim in order to replace the US. So if we go back to another China daily piece, they say that experts have explained the credit given to China for helping Saudi Arabia and Iran resume diplomatic relations. They say that Beijing continues to play a crucial and constructive leadership role in the quest for world peace, demonstrating China's position as a major power. Obviously, China also wants economic stability along these Belt and Road corridors, as we've discussed. Transactional diplomacy, just because neutrality is something that is difficult to achieve, does it mean that we shouldn't try and achieve it? Does it mean that we should just go down China's transactional route? Perhaps the negotiating body actually having a stake in the outcome of negotiations and mediations is actually helpful, like can actually bring real results. It's early days, but the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal is a successful deal as far as we can see. It remains to be seen what China can do in an actual ongoing conflict, as we see in Ukraine and Russia. If they bring that to a close, who will any of us be to argue with them if they can bring a halt to the bloodshed? So those are all my questions for you guys. I'm sorry that there were so many. Do leave comments and write to me and let me know what you think about these questions. I'd really love to hear from you guys. I don't know one way or the other. A lot of you guys can be a lot more opinionated than I can. I just like to sort of take all the information and talk about it and then just kind of leave it for you guys to discuss. So that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget that Sinobabble also has a newsletter. You can head over to Substack and look it up over there. And don't forget, you can also support my efforts by buying me a coffee. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/SinobabblePod and give a one-off or monthly donation, whatever you like, or you can continue to listen for free. It's always nice to just have you here. And I'll see you in the next episode.